Ebola, and as you can see, we're going to go through over on the side here all of these things up to right there because we've already talked about HIV co-receptor changes. That's the CCR5 mutation. And we've already talked about IFIT-M3, so we don't need to talk about either of those. So there we go. That's what we're going to go through for Ebola, and this is where the questions are going to come, so let's pay attention. Actually, and let's go full screen. All right. So what we've got here is the early stages to near the end of the 2014/late 2013 to 2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And so this is just going to be used as a typical Ebola outbreak, but as you can see here, they were getting something like twice as many cases per day as deaths per day. But toward the end, you can see these two are sort of catching up a little bit. They get a little closer because it takes a while for people to actually die from Ebola. That's the idea. Now, the other thing in here is that we think that the death numbers are probably higher. We think they're probably underestimated by about twofold, as are the infection numbers. Because a lot of people, rather than reporting the illness to the authorities, decided to run away or go home and often ended up infecting other people or just dying by themselves. So, Ebola is not just bad for people. Ebola is also bad for, animals. So this is from an older outbreak from August 2007. So you've got a mystery fever, which turns out to be Ebola virus fever. Is going to kill people over here in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And from December of the year before, this is in a similar area, if I remember right. So here, actually, it was around Bangui, if I remember right. There were a lot of deaths in gorillas. So gorillas have a similar immune system to us and are also susceptible to a lot of the same viruses that we can get. And gorillas like this one actually have a much higher rate of death. So it's about a 95% kill rate for Ebola virus in gorillas. Because, of course, they don't have hospitals or, good care. They look after each other to some extent, but it's not the same as you can get in a clinic or a hospital. And so here's the really sad thing there. So let's see. Pre-epidemic, this is the males to females, something like that. And so if you had 68 of them there, you'd have 22 males and 45 females. They tend to have large groups of females. They tend to kick the young males out, but there are a few young males they let stick around. And so of those, most of them are in social groups. 94% are in one of five social groups. Only 3% are solitary. And the other ones, I think they're not sure if they're fully attached to a group or not. So that's pre-epidemic. Post-epidemic, there were only 13 left in this particular group. So this one wasn't as badly hit as some of those others. But now, instead of having a high female-to-male ratio, it's about even. And even though there were more females there. And if you look at that, the survivors are now down to two groups. So 3 of those gorilla societies have just disappeared. And almost half of the gorillas that survive are now solitary. So they survived by abandoning society, which is kind of the way that social distancing works in the animal kingdom sometimes. Here's another population of them. So this one was more balanced. But everybody was in some kind of social group there. And after the outbreak, which only got to a couple of them, a lot of the rest left. Look at that. You have just the same breakdown in society. Even though there weren't many deaths, the rest of society just sort of fell apart. Now, there was a follow-up study to this, and it showed that in about 2 years, these societies were starting to reform and the guerrillas were starting to group back up again. But yeah, it's a long time to go without anybody. It seems very lonely. And yeah, this, unlike the coronavirus, this seems to be more severe in females than in males. Okay, so what does Ebola virus look like? So this is a rhesus macaque, and a rhesus monkey, if you like, and it's showing all the signs of Ebola. So Ebola actually doesn't cause anything particularly dramatic that you can see on the outside of the body in most cases. In a few cases, very small percentage, you'll get actual hemorrhaging from the mouth or the eyes or the nose, something like that. But that is really rare, and from what somebody who works on this told me, that's only in fatal cases where everything breaks down. Much more common are these little spots that are called petechiae. So let's see. Here we go. Here's our word, petechiae. And a petechia is a little tiny dot that if you were to roll like a clear glass over it, the dot would not go away. So like if you squeeze your finger, you can squeeze the blood out and it goes a little bit lighter and then boom, it comes back and you can tell you're alive. These are things that are more like a bruise. So if you squeeze on it, it just it doesn't go anywhere because these are actually little tiny subdermal hemorrhages where the blood vessels have broken down and yeah, the blood has leaked out and made a little pool there under the skin. So these are a sign of hemorrhagic fever, and these are the hemorrhage. So occasionally you'll get these spots on the outside, and you do get a few in humans, although you get more in these monkeys. And the other main symptom is going to be these little bloody packets right there on part of the gut. So there you can see it's on the outside of the, looks like the large intestine. And so this is just the outer lining of the large intestine, but it's kind of filled up with hemorrhage blood. And so you got some hemorrhagey blood in that sort of space between the external and internal layers there. So a little subdermal hemorrhage. And also, so here's the peritoneum, like the body cavity. You can see those little red dots along there. Those are also little hemorrhages. And those probably wouldn't show through on the skin, but it's the same sort of thing. You've got small to medium arteries just breaking down, losing containment. And it makes you realize that the body is really a hydraulic machine. So you've got all this blood that's flowing around that's helping us both keep our shape and stay alive. And if those pipes break down, it is absolutely catastrophic. So here are some, just for comparison's sake, some Ebola outbreaks and the fatality rates. So yeah, really bad one in 76, 88% fatality rate on 318 cases. Ridiculously bad. You got other cases where there's only one person and they either live or die. And so you got these two main strains, the Zaire strain, which tends to be highly, highly pathogenic. And so Zaire strain, Ebola Zaire, 81, 68, 75, 50, 88, all the really high ones. Then you've got the Ebola virus Sudan strain. This tends to be a little bit milder, tends to be around 50% fatality rate. There's a big 53% on a large one. And of course, now we have the Ebola West African or Ebola Cote d'Ivoire strain. And this is the one that broke out in 2014 and killed all those people. And that's now the most deadly Ebola outbreak in all of history. So, what is it about Ebola that causes this disease? All right, so this is going to get you started. And then you're going to do a little more reading to figure out and kind of understand the disease. So Ebola virus is going to come in through either mucosal surfaces, eyes, nose, mouth, or through something like a skin abrasion, like a scrape or a needle stick that can do it. But the virus only works if it can get access to some immune cells. So it does well in the immune system and does not do well on your epithelium, for example. So if you have, if this is your mucosal membrane surface, these little guys that are up in here, they're kind of star-shaped, are called Langerhans cells. So they're going to be similar to dendritic cells. They just live embedded here in the epidermal tissue. And here we've got a dendritic cell. These guys, I think, are usually resident in tissues, but there's different populations. Um, and so what the virus will do is, if there's a little break in the epithelium, it can get attached to one of those Langerhans cells. And then the Langerhans cells or the dendritic cells, wherever it happens to land, can actually carry the virus. So there's a receptor on the outside of the cells called DC sign. And to remember, that's the same receptor that carried the coronavirus along. So these cells will actually sometimes carry bits of viruses, and they go to a lymph node and they can show the entire virus to parts of the immune system. It's probably an adaptive trait that helps keep us alive in some situations. But in this situation, the virus can bind to the Langerhans or dendritic cell, is carried into the bloodstream by that cell, and then its real target, the ones that it infects, are the macrophages. So it'll be released there when the dendritic cell goes to meet up with macrophages in the bloodstream, or goes to meet up with other cells of the immune system in the lymph nodes. And so the major organs where this virus is going to grow are going to be in the lung. And you actually have a lot of white blood cells that stay resident in the lung. So once you've had the flu or something, the reason why you're only immune for a year is that for about a year you will have lots of those white blood cells that hang out in the lung, and they will pound any related flu viruses that happen to come near you. After a year, they kind of give up and wander away, and they'll go down to the spleen, or they'll get tucked away in other little cavities. And so they're not there in the lung. And so even though you still have those white blood cells, they don't do anything for you because they're not in the right place to see the antigen. Virus also grows really well in the liver and the spleen. So Ebola virus is one that needs to get access to the bloodstream. And then from the bloodstream, it's going to go to the major organs. And on the way there, it is going to directly infect macrophages. And it can also directly infect the cells on endothelial cells that are lining your veins and arteries. So what does the disease look like? Well, it's called a cytokine storm. And this is going to be another good topic for you to look up for discussion board posts or something like that. The idea behind a cytokine storm is that cytokines are these little tiny proteins, for the most part, that are released by macrophages and other cells in the innate immune system. And so they have these little granules that are packed full of chemicals. And so here, imagine these were granules that weren't full of virus, but all those cytokines. And here is the cell, and it's released one of those granules, and here are all the little cytokines coming out. And so there are lots of different cytokines in there, and these are all chemicals that are highly active at either causing cells to die or doing something that helps the immune system fight disease. So one thing that they'll do is these cytokines will cause the endothelium to loosen up. This is sometimes good because this is how cells are able to, that are patrolling the bloodstream, are able to sense danger and then sneak through. They have to actually go out of the veins and arteries, and they go through that the endothelial cells. They'll go through either a gap between them, or some of them will actually just punch a hole right through the middle of an endothelial cell, which then usually heals and goes back to normal. And so that's how we deal with damage in the tissues. Problem is that a lot of these things, in addition to having the effects on the cells that are nearby, will also call for more help and can activate other macrophages. And so the primitive version of a macrophage is called a monocyte. That's like the unactivated version. And so monocytes will become macrophages once they see the virus. So we call them monocyte macrophages. They're along the same continuum. They're very similar. And so these are some of the factors that are released in a cytokine storm. And so as more of these pro-inflammatory cytokines are released, and chemokines, so pro-inflammatory means calling in other cells from the immune system, including more macrophages, we're going to attract more macrophages and other monocytes, which are a group of cells in the immune system, and neutrophils are a particularly notorious one. And these guys come in and then dump all their contents, which calls in more cells that come in and dump all their contents. And normally there are mechanisms where we can turn this off. But if you activate this system too hard, these cytokines, it actually just stays on. And in Ebola, it's not the virus that's really damaging you. What you're seeing there, all that hemorrhagic fever, is really caused by your own immune system trying to get rid of the virus. And so certain parts of the immune system are going to be helpful, but the cytokine storm, basically tantrum side of the immune response is not going to help much at all. So let's look at these things. So tumor necrosis factor is a little protein that will tell cells to kill themselves. So when a macrophage releases that on a cell, it's the time for that cell to die. Nitric oxide, you'll remember that's the thing that was NO. That's how we write the chemical symbol. And that can break and make free radicals that will then go off and just break the next protein or molecule of any kind that they run into. Interleukin 1 beta is an extremely, extremely potent pro-inflammatory cytokine. So this is a little protein that calls in sort of the strongest response that your immune system can give. And normally in an infection, you'll use a little bit of this stuff right at the beginning to get things going, and then you want to regulate it and turn it off. But in the cytokine storm, you just keep on making interleukin 1 beta, which keeps activating things and, just making a mess out of your body. MIP1 alpha, macrophage inflammatory protein 1 alpha, is another one of those, and it's an activator of macrophages. Okay, so you remember those things over here, right? These are the things that happen when you survive. These are the things that happen when you die. And the big difference is whether or not you make that cytokine storm or whether you make a dendritic cell response that leads to a killer T cell response that leads to virus clearance. Cytokine storm is what's going to kill you. And the only reason you make a cytokine storm is if there are no good activated T cells and B cells to go in and knock out the virus and prevent this from happening. So that's the difference. And now we're going to go into why that happens in the next part. All right, so come back. Stay tuned for the next episode of Ebola virus and you.